frankly, I'm glad to hear people speak about other things other than my case. And it's hard not to be entirely too self-absorbed in my own head, considering what me and my family and a great many of supporters, many of you who have been sort of shepherding with me in the last few months. So I appreciate that. In hearing about the other concerns and observations and analysis about what's happening in San Francisco. And what's interesting, I think, taking off on what a few speakers have mentioned has allowed me to reflect while you were talking about what my observations are. Aside from my own personal case, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions about this, as a member of the Board of Supervisors for 7 years, I worked for the district attorney for 9 years here in San Francisco. And before that, I was a legislative aide in San Francisco for then Supervisor, then Terrence Hallinan in the mid-1990s, early 1990s. So I had 17 years of, before I was suspended as sheriff, of public service working for the city and county of San Francisco. And my politics, as I think most know, come from the left, progressive. And I can tell you that as I had moved from the Board of Supervisors and running for sheriff and seeing dynamics change through recent elections, over the last 2 elections in particular, while we really lament, I think nationally speaking, and why we watch with great concern of the divide between rich and poor that plays itself out, emblematic of great fights like in Wisconsin, for example, or legislative battles, if they're not embroiled in gridlock in Washington. You feel that great divide that much more. But what's tricky is that in San Francisco, it's not felt as much because we are known as one of the most forward-thinking, cutting-edge cities, politically, social justice-wise, and otherwise. But what it does is it creates a projection that I think lulls people into a false sense of security in its own politics. That what was once maybe considered progressive of the 1980s or 90s, or as those who like to be nostalgic about the class of 2000 of the Board of Supervisors, which has since now moved on, those days are not here anymore. And the level of dissent and the level of, I think, nonviolent confrontation in really expressing oneself, which used to be routine and tradition amongst labor family, amongst the left, amongst progressives, amongst different communities who would then affiliate with many of those other institutions. That is now, from all intents and purposes, I think, dissipated considerably. And as somebody who kind of came up in that movement in the great many decades, I really see sort of that lacking of where the loyal opposition is in some ways. There seems to be a fusion, almost as a friend of mine who was referring to over coffee recently. It's almost like the invasion of the body snatchers has taken over, where I am amused or bemused when I hear Gavin Newsom talk on Bill Maher about progressive San Francisco. I don't know about you, but it rings immensely hollow to me. And I think, though, that I feel sometimes I'm really in a minority position because I'm expecting greater challenge by people who I have known over the years, and yet those people who are not making the challenge, and I'm not the most credible messenger these days to articulate that challenge as I used to. I now understand why they don't, because it's now come to a place where they've retreated into a position where they have to sort of operate in a mode of fear, out of fear, and in a survival mode of their own political preservation. And that's a dangerous climate for a city like San Francisco to be in, and it's a turning point that I'm trying to really understand much better, because what it does is it sends the message that were not, in that imagery that people like former mayors want to really kind of pitch. That's not happening anymore. And I have to tell you, that could have been more emblematic than when I was inaugurated sheriff on Sunday, January 8th, in front of nearly 1,000 people at the Herbst Theater, one of the proudest moments of my life, having my family with me, and we were able to achieve a great feat and in a very hotly contested race, where I laid out, and I often say too much, where I laid out where my vision will meet policy. And I did not know until I was sort of informed a couple days later by friends and confidants of mine of how threatening some of this was. And here I was just simply standing on a platform that I ran on, nothing that really came of surprise based on how people knew me as a member of the Board of Supervisors, but made it clear that now that I was elected citywide in an executive position, a position that nobody has been elected to since Mayor Art Agnos since 1987. If you want to account for Jeff Adachi's election as public defender citywide, there is literally nobody who's been elected to a citywide position of executive office in 25 years. So I don't think I appreciated the value of our impact to be able then to send message to institutions like the police department, which I did in my inaugural by saying that it's time we now realign not just what the state is asking us to do of our prison population, but realign how criminal justice operates, the system in itself operates in San Francisco. And I, as one of the top elected law enforcement officials, proceeded to explain how we're going to do that. And coming off the heels of a district supervisor where I inherited a district that had the second highest murder rate for about 20 years in the Western District of Fillmore, largely due to, I think, the neglect and symptomatic of what Steve was talking about, the ravages of bad decisions due to redevelopment that set in motion, I think, a lot of the ramifications that I had to confront and inherited. And when I used to beg for foot patrols and community policing, well, I made it known that I now have a staff of over 1,000 deputy sheriffs, or a staff that included deputy sheriffs, over 1,000 people, and where there would be deficits of policing and staffing for community policing, it's time that we step up from the sheriff's department, do our job in managing the jails and community programs, but also there is maybe a higher calling. That can be threatening, especially to a law enforcement agency who's paid 25% more, meaning the police department, than the sheriffs. And I was reminded of that. I made it clear that building on the Hennessy, my predecessor, Mike Hennessy's legacy, that we have to call attention to the fact that we're one of the largest cities in the United States. In fact, we are the largest city in the United States that has the fastest exodus of its black population anywhere. And that while economics plays a central role in that out-migration, it's the criminal justice industry too. And when I articulated the statistic that the jail population, which averages about 1,600 a day or more, 60% of that population is African American, and then the next click down is about 25 to 30% Latino, that I, as sheriff, will exercise, I think, the discretion that would be afforded to me by the new laws of the state in realigning the demography of the population itself. That was meant in order to explain that I want to do something about the high recidivism rates, and simply by stalling and keeping people incarcerated and not confronting the city of coming up with real job and housing programs that gives people that second chance effectively, was simply just sweeping this under the rug. And I also made it clear that, as it was referenced earlier, and I did go to SF General and Laguna Honda a few times, as a candidate for sheriff and as a supervisor, that those on the street are not just homeless and those in the street who find themselves in the criminal justice system, a huge and growing percentage suffer from mental illness. And this city pretty much has abdicated its responsibility completely in dealing with this growing population. And I refuse, absolutely have refused, that the way that to simply triage this population is put them in our jail system. When I made it clear to the Department of Public Health that I want to see increased funding towards our ability to classify, by not lumping everybody together, and by treating people in a way that jails do not become sort of the revolving hotel for those suffering from mental health. Now that was a direct salvo in an administration that was dismantling and continues to dismantle mental health services out of SF General and Laguna Honda, especially for a transitory population inside San Francisco. And to top it off, I just simply wanted to also underscore my complete support for the legalization of marijuana, and that I would not have anybody in my jail system, quite frankly, who would be incarcerated, I think, for use and possession of marijuana. And that while everybody talks a good game in San Francisco about this, especially as it relates to medical cannabis, we see the assault by the federal government literally undermining the work. And by the way, I was the supervisor who created the first regulations in the United States of the medical cannabis dispensaries that have been borrowed now by 12 other states who followed Prop 215 laws in a city like San Francisco. As I wrote recently, that was published in the Chronicle in an opinion piece this past Sunday, in my wildest nightmare, I never expected that I could be an example of what that power of redemption would look like, but I stand true and I believe tall to the idea that I would exemplify that well. I also believe that I'm duly elected by the people of San Francisco. And I understand that the power, I think, of when people do not want one who's been elected to either not re-elect me or to recall me, that's somebody in my position. It sets an incredibly bad precedent in San Francisco that the chief executive, who I'm an elected peer of, to be able to use unlimited resources of the city, and I mean unlimited resources. I saw that the San Francisco Examiner recently reported that they've now exceeded over $1 million in their prosecution of me, of taxpayer-funded, funds to prosecute me. To be able to do that and do so in a form like the Ethics Commission, where many of you have also had your own and spoke of your own experiences with them, sets a very high wall, and I think in our ability to be able to hope for the kind of fair and just system that we would like. But I believe it's important that we endure this process, and endure a process where somebody like myself, who has been, if I can indulge you a second, somebody like myself who's been incredibly dehumanized in the eyes of the press, to the point where the narrative that has been well led by the Chronicle and others in painting me in a way that, and still to this day, I feel great shame and humiliation. But I haven't lost sight of some perspective, and that is that I am human. I have made mistakes, and I believe that elected officials who recognize those mistakes can still go on to be effective and honest and true leaders as the people had voted for them. And this is one of the reasons why, I won't capitulate in a way that they had thought, and they continue to get so nasty and continue to pile on because they expected that I would just resign, and I won't, and I hadn't. And so I see that that's what we're kind of coming to heads to. So I'll stop here and answer any questions, but that sort of puts into a nutshell, if I have, the experience I'm going through, and larger than me, because I think what I'm now going through is not about me anymore. It's not about Ross Mirkarimi. It's not about the sheriff. Frankly, it's transcended from that. If they prevail, from ethics and then to the Board of Supervisors, they set a template in motion which will be a first in the city and county of San Francisco. And that template will certainly add to the quiver, their arsenal, so that if there's somebody else they don't like, for whatever reasons, and for whatever their thread that they want to pull on as a vehicle for their dislike or discontent with another elected, that will change politics forever in how our democratic process is now then modified by an alternative process that can remove people from office. It's a dangerous, dangerous precedent. And for what anybody might think, and I tell others, don't take my word for it, take my wife's word for it, Ileana, who I haven't seen, by the way, since January 13th. And the system has been awfully vicious because she's never asked for the separation, has never desired any stay away. But in their, I think, approach in suspending me without pay, without due process, and incapacitating me from being able to provide for my family, which I only can do, I think, out of the need of being both husband and father and asking my wife and supporting her to be in her home country, Venezuela, so she can be supported by her family and her need to work, and so that she has that warm support, only highlights that much more that the government here, and I'm not saying that they're wrong in bringing attention to issues that may give people concern or pause about me, but in the way that they're doing it, in the way that they want to cast aspersions, in the way that they want to discredit who I am through character assassination, or be able then to use this as a vehicle which is everything in but what they're saying in politics. It is a political vehicle. Then what this becomes, in effect, is a takeover. And that is what is happening, a takeover. And if it was somebody else sitting in my position, and I ask myself, as honestly as I possibly can, ask myself with great reflection when I go through this coping every single day, if it was somebody whose politics I did not like that was in this position, if it was somebody I did not support but facing the same level of experience and reality, would I also have these same feelings? And the answer is yes. Because it's not about the politics of the person or the personality or even to the point of them committing an act as they did and then trying to take responsibility. It is much larger than that. It is literally about the precedence that sets in forward exactly how those who are your political enemies, those who have an alternative agenda, spoken or not, and how they can be able to remove somebody who's duly elected. Dangerous. Thank you. We're doing and did. One of those regarding the foreclosure question is I was changing policy because I had the discretion as the executive of the department. And the Sheriff's Department, by the way, is one of the largest departments in the city. It had a budget. It does not quite now, going through the budget process that I've been monitoring, about $170 million and a department staff of over 1,000 people, as I said. The Sheriff's Department in all 58 counties of California, the elected sheriff is responsible for facilitating the evictions when court orders are passed forward. Now, seeing the escalation of foreclosures in San Francisco, watching that as a supervisor and feeling incredibly frustrated about our lack of a municipal response, I knew as sheriff there was a slice of that response that I could actually do something about. So in motion, I was able, and I actually had written an op-ed for The Guardian, which never ran because it was the week I was suspended. And so they decided to hold back from it. And that was that under penalty of perjury, that any plaintiff or lending institution that would send forward to the Sheriff's Department a order of eviction, that if it's resulting from foreclosure, and that wasn't detailed of all the information on foreclosure, I had ordered our deputy sheriffs not to evict. And I did that based on the fact that under penalty of perjury, which still does not exist in the Sheriff's Department, that we would require that if we did not have complete information, because it's a court order, we don't have the legal analysis to say good or bad eviction, true foreclosure or not true foreclosure, but since nobody else was doing anything, that was a slice that I was able to do something about. And the fact that that has now been halted from us moving forward is still of great concern. And that is something that we'd be able to do. Phil Ting's white paper on foreclosures remains just that, a paper. I don't see it mounting to the kind of change that I think it needs to on a local or state level, which I hope he's able to effectuate in his road to the Assembly. But if it wasn't for groups like Occupy Bernal, who have done great in spotlighting the need for reforming foreclosure laws and its satellite attendant ramifications, like causing the sheriff's department to have to evict due to improper foreclosures, then I doubt very little change would happen in San Francisco. And when my return reinstatement in the sheriff's office, I promise you that I will put that policy into place, and I will shed light on the fact that if there are improper foreclosures, I will stall those evictions resulting from foreclosures. And it's not just property owners, it's tenants, too, who are implicated in this crisis. On the question of Ms. Madison, it's true, and that will come out, and it has been out for a number of months, that the incident that occurred between my wife and I on our way to lunch December 31st, she shared this information with our neighbor, whom she believed was an attorney and her attorney on January 1st. 4 days had passed when she'd shared this information, and we did not know this until records had been subpoenaed by us time later, that the neighbor, Ms. Madison, and husband had been talking to a number of other people like Phil Bronstein, executive editor of the Chronicle. Our investigator interviewed Mr. Bronstein, so we actually have a complete record of it, of what was said. There wasn't any urgency or excited utterance or exigent circumstance that needed, obviously, for the neighbor to call the police or domestic violence advocates or a social worker. None of that ever happened. What they did was they float the story to a number of people. But when we got the records, with the exception of Phil Bronstein, who we were already fortunate enough to interview, all the records have come back redacted. So it looks like a CIA, sort of like everything is blackened out completely. So we only know who it's from. We don't know who they're all to. But there are a lot of suspicions as to who the two are.
Well, wait.
You decide, please. Sorry.
No, wait.
I don't actually have a question. I just want to make a statement here.
It feels, well, but I mean, he, as chief executive, he in his own mind is saying that he's doing the job that he thinks he should be doing. And I don't want to be too gratuitous about, but coming out of an election that those in more conservative institutions believed I would not win and that they would, and I was outspent 2-1, winning nearly 7 supervisoral out of 11 supervisoral districts, and not just the traditional liberal pockets of San Francisco. That wowed them and us at the same time. I mean, and as it was said, exceeding the vote considerably than of Ed Lee. So the triad that the Chronicle was really hoping for, and others, was one of them was certainly George Gascon, DA, and Ed Lee, and one of my opponents, Mr. Cunney. When the election was over and the Chronicle congratulated winners, they had, as I think is etiquette of newspapers that sum it all up, they had congratulations Ed Lee, congratulations George Gascon. They didn't even recognize my race, and they didn't even recognize our victory, and it was just so stunning, and I think just kind of set in tone in November when the election was called, how that kind of fertilized into what they pulled on as an opportunity to try to then just oust me, to displace me. I think that there are institutions, both in law enforcement and then I think downtown, where I have had high-profile fights with, very high-profile fights. PG&E, for example, many others. And I'm not saying that they have fingerprints on this, but it's certainly an opportunity for people who would like to, I think, score. This is that opportunity to make that happen. And considering when you see polls are published that remain anonymous, that are not disclosed by the Chronicle, about Mirkarimi is, the worst sheriff in the galaxy, and or unpopular or whatever the case is, or Ed Lee. I mean, it only raises more questions about who's paying for this stuff. They don't have to expose any of this. It's not a campaign where it's required by law that they have to expose where this stuff is coming from. But more than just sort of the free media, there is a well-orchestrated public relations campaign. Oh, completely. I was one of 3 people who wrote the modern sunshine laws for San Francisco and directed the campaign with several others, Proposition G, which we won. So I have intimate familiarity with our sunshine laws, and there's some dysfunction a little bit with it that could use some tweaking. But what I'm noticing and hearing about is the complete dismantling of sunshine laws here in San Francisco. And what's really trippy about it is that how San Francisco, where our branding and our reputation of being liberal, cutting edge, everything else, there are cities like in Texas who are much more advanced in their implementation of disclosure, Freedom of Information Act, locally sunshine laws, that have now taken full effect and embraced by whatever their multi-party partisanship is down there. But that is now withering away in San Francisco quickly.
And they're trying to shut down the commission. Scott Weiner,
That's right.
others want to get rid of the Sunshine Commission, want to get rid of Bruce Wolf and other people. There's a whole retaliation against commissioners because they're doing their job.
Was the insurance commissioner, so we watched that very carefully. Yes, I remember that. And the assessor, recorder of Los Angeles County, just stepped down while under investigation, so he was suspended with pay. And so, and he's locally elected, county level, as I am too, county sheriff in that regard. But again, and we tried to bring this up in Superior Court, we failed. And it just, I really try to maintain a level of being measured and thinking like they're not all conspiring together, like how can we screw them now? But it doesn't fit with everything else that's going on. And it just really does, I think, add to the theory that it's just one more thing and they're hoping they break my back and I walk away. And frankly, I am in poverty. I mean, I have had to set up a legal defense fund. I have debt of over $150,000 now in attorney's fees, and I'm not working because I'm seeking my job, and I'm not even entitled to unemployment. So it literally paralyzes my ability to be able to just kind of survive. So frankly, there's a couple of you in the room and others, a great network that's growing out there that I really live off good home-cooked meals of people in their charity.
The civil branch, I want to just point out the tremendous disparity in justice.
Tammy Bryant, who's been really very helpful, and a lot of other friends here too. So we return to the next installment this Thursday on the 28th. It's at 5 p.m. What room is it? 263. Room 263. And then all day on Friday the 29th, which is, I believe, room 400, right? Room 400. And I don't know if they're going to allow public comment because they use a procedural, which I knew how to do too, that you continue from the previous meeting so that his comments about me and calling me a wife beater, which he did, can I tell you something that whatever his perspective may be, one, it's not the truth, but two, it's incredibly undignified for a mayor to do that. And three, that no matter where their case may be going and the way that it's been going, because we've been able to really hold our ground in some regard, despite the very high wall of resources that we have to scale that they have erected for us. I feel that level of nastiness and viciousness in the way they have to do that, because we're not doing that, and we haven't, really should be repudiated. I don't care if people are supporters or not of me or of the mayor, it doesn't matter. But that does not reflect well in San Francisco. Ethics Commission, and obviously there are many experts here on the Ethics Commission, 5 members appointed each by the mayor, district attorney, board of supervisors, the assessor recorder, and the city attorney. And the question I think Cecilia posed is, how do we think we're doing? Well, we're not lobbying the Ethics Commission. I have to say, I think our legal team did a strong job in the last installment. I don't think the press is quite reporting in the way that it should, at least not the Chronicle, but one of the commissioners, who is a well-known trial attorney, Paul Rennie, really called out the city attorney because of the very just slanderous declaration by the neighbor, where it was not based on fact, but all inflammatory. And it wasn't even the city attorney who wrote the declaration. They submitted it. It was the neighbor's attorney who wrote it. And to paraphrase Commissioner Rennie, he basically called out the city attorney and says, not even a first-year law student would submit this. But that didn't get reported in the Chronicle, it did in the Examiner. I thought the Examiner did a strong job in giving the account of what happened. My concern about the process, and I'm just, my role is just to sit there until I'm required to speak, is that the branding of negativity has just been so immense over the last few months. And even, as I said earlier, recently with the mayor making those really also very defaming comments earlier, it's politics then that begins to take over and not the evidence, I think, of the case in itself. And that can worry any one of us. But it's once Ethics Commission, which I believe will wrap it up in July, then renders its opinion, and then the process, it goes forward to the Board of Supervisors. And it's to the 11 members of the Board of Supervisors who will then vote on whether to reinstate me or to sustain the mayor's charges of misconduct, which doesn't just terminate me from sheriff, it bars me from city government forever, from employment or from holding elected office. So I think, again, that just adds to our concern about that level of precedent that's being driven here. And it will take 3 supervisors or more to vote with us in order to reinstate. And I think the possibilities are there, but we're not head counting, we're not lobbying. There are wonderful people who are out there trying to do what they can, but we're respecting the supervisors because they're not allowed to talk about the case. People can talk to them, but they can't in return, not supposed to talk back or exchange ideas about it. So we'll see what happens. So I think this thing wraps up within the next month to 2. In chief, in a criminal court proceeding, I would never testify first, but I'm actually being required to testify first. When it's the mayor's case, in essence, the prosecution should testify first, but they're not. So I feel like in some ways it is orchestrated where the rules don't support sort of the even position that is required in, criminal courts at all. So by making me testify first begins to red flag, why this process feels a little bit sort of uneven.